What's up guys, welcome back. I painted this ogre up for a client recently. He's going to use it as a Morg'n Thorg proxy for his Bloodbowl team that I painted a couple of years ago. For the skin I used Resurrection Flesh. This is from Scale Colour's Fantasy and Games range. I mixed in some Screamer Pink and then a bit of Scale Colour Field Green to desaturate it. When you're doing flesh, it's always a good idea to start with a flat colour and then add vibrancy later with glazes. So I'll often add some grey or green to the base just to tone it down a bit. I then gave the skin a light wash with Reikland Flesh Shade, making sure not to allow it to pool. Highlights were built up gradually by adding Scale Colour Golden Skin to the base mix. I keep the paint thin here and just push it over the surface, drawing the pigment up towards the top of the muscles. Once this was built up to pure golden skin, I started doing glazes into the shadows. The first glaze was made by adding some Indian Shadow into the base tone. This was glazed down into the lower side of the muscles and on the side of the head, drawing the pigment towards the top of the ear. Further glazes were made by adding some Caspian blue into the previous glaze mix. For the face stubble, I simply added some Caspian blue to the base colour and then glazed over the jawline, drawing the pigment down towards the chin. The veins were done by adding some more Screamer Pink to the base colour. I then added a little Caspian blue to the mix and underlined each vein to create a subtle shadow. A further subtle glaze of Caspian blue was then applied over the top in order to give them a more veiny look. The leather parts were based in a mix of brown leather and black. Then I started highlighting with brown leather by painting lots of lines across each strap. I tried to do this quite quickly and haphazardly. Mars Orange was then added to the brown leather and lots of little lines were painted along the edges of the straps. I tried to vary the length of the lines quite randomly so that I don't build up a pattern. I then pick a couple of spots along the lower edge of the strap and create points of interest. To do this, I highlight these spots by adding Iroko to the mix. I then use the same mix to edge highlight the top edge. The metalwork was based in a 1-to-1 mix of Bering blue and black. Then highlights were added with Bering blue before finishing off with some sharp broken white reflex highlights along the edge. For the green metal armour parts, I first based in Waagh flesh, then I blocked in the highlight with Warboss green. This was blended out by making a 1-to-1 mix of Waagh flesh and Warboss green, which I then applied over the transition between the two colours. Highlights were built up by adding more and more white into the Warboss green, before ending in small sharp white highlights. A shade was made by glazing down with Vallejo Armour Brown. For the battle damage, I painted on a line or a dot with Armour Brown, and then I highlighted the lower edge with the same bright highlight that we used earlier. I used the exact same colours for the shorts, I just didn't go as high with the highlights this time. The red wreaths were based in dark red. This was made by mixing Mephiston red and black. These were then highlighted up, first with Mephiston red, and then further highlights were made by adding Mars orange. I then finished off by adding lots of small dots with pure white. This was just to keep the same sort of shiny feel that we have on the rest of the armour. The gold parts were based in XV88, then highlights were added with Vallejo Japanese uniform. I added progressively more white to the Japanese uniform in order to build up the highlight. I then glazed with Armour Brown in order to build up the shadow, and then added small white dots along the edge to give that sparkly look. For the base, I first took this orc head off an old Orc Boy sprue. I just cut that hairpiece off there, that would have been a bit too over the top for the base. In order to get it to look like it was sunk into the base, I simply cut a wedge off the side of the face, and then I sanded it down so that it sat flush onto the base. It was then glued in place with some plastic glue. After that I rolled out 3 bits of green stuff into quite thin sausages, which I braided together and glued onto the base, pushing them up against the neck of the orc's head. Sand was then glued onto the base in the usual way. To paint this, I first based the sand in XV88, and then I washed in Army Painter Strong Tone. The surface was then dry brushed with some Iroko. To paint the orc's head, I first based in Lauren Forest, then I made a wash by mixing some Scrag Brown with a bit of Rhinox hide. I added a couple of drops of water and a drop of Lamium Medium. This was then simply washed over the whole head. Highlights were started with Lauren Forest and then built up by mixing in Vallejo Ivory to lighten it. The mouth was based in the same colour we used on the leather, with a bit of Screamer Pink mixed in. The teeth were picked out with Iroko, and then the whole mouth area was washed with Seraphim Sepia. The tongue was based with Indian Shadow and then highlighted by adding some white to the base colour. For the gore that's coming out of his neck, I first based in Indian Shadow, and then I mixed a little Tamiya Clear Red with Tamiya Smoke, and simply painted this over the top. I added a couple of blood spatters here and there just for effect. Static grass was glued on randomly over the base, then a white pitch line was added using Vallejo Ghost Grey. Alright, so I think that's everything. I hope you found this useful. Don't forget to like and share the video, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you all next time. Thanks again. Bye for now.